Hey, this is Nick McPhee, and I'm going to do a quick example, hopefully helping you debug shell scripting with bats. So I'm in a project. I've got some bats tests, and they fail. And I'm not sure why they fail, and I'm not sure how to read what's going on. And there's two things here to talk about. One is I'm printing out the bat's temporary directory, which means we can go there and see what's actually happening in the test. And that actually could be really useful. And then the other thing is we've got this output, and it's not obvious how to read that. And so I'm going to talk about how we might read and understand that output. So let's actually first talk about the output, and then we'll go look at the file some. So if we actually look at the bats tests, less tests wrap contents bats. Without going through all the details, one thing that's important here is this is where that temp directory line is coming out. So we're making temp make is a bats thing that makes a temporary directory using whatever is appropriate for your operating system. And then here I'm printing out, well, what is that directory, so that we can go there and look and see what bats universe was when the test failed. Because otherwise it's really hard to know what's going on and see what's happening. I also have bats temp preserve on failure set to 1, which means that if the test fails, it will keep the temp directory. If the test succeeds, it would actually delete the temp directory. But I'm here saying, well, if the test fails, don't delete the temp directory because I might want to go in and have a look. If you're feeling more confident about your script and your testing, you might set that to its default, which is 0, which is saying don't bother keeping it ever, to reduce clutter on your system if you run a bunch of bats tests. But when you're still trying to figure stuff out, it's useful to know that is going to be there so you can go look at it. So that's how we know where bats did its thing. And we can go there and look and see what bats is doing. Now, the other thing is we want to go down and look at the actual tests that are failing. So these last two tests here, these are the tests that are actually failing. And both of them run diff as their last line before assert success. Diff is a Unix command that takes two files and checks to see if they're the same. It finds their differences. And if they're identical, then it is successful. If they're different, then it's considered unsuccessful, and it outputs the differences in a format that's not entirely obvious to read. And the WBB business here, this is saying basically ignore every kind of white space difference you can. In this instance, white space generally doesn't matter. And so I want to make sure that just because you've indented a different number of spaces than me, or you've got some blank spaces at the end of lines, I don't want diff to say, oh, those files are different, and be really confusing, right? So the WBB basically say, ignore any kind of white space blank stuff. So if we go back to looking at our output, this output is actually from diff. So when it says status 1, it's saying that diff returned a non-zero status. And when the two files that diff gets handed are different, then it returns a status of 1. And then the output is the output from diff. And the question then is, well, what does that mean? And what diff is saying is that to make your file to make the expected output match your file, it would need to delete, that's what the D here is, lines 8 through 11 of the expected output would have to be deleted to make your content make the expected output match yours. And that means you're missing these lines. If we have to delete those from the expected output, you're going to have to add them to get things to match. And so this tells us that something's probably gone wrong with the footer. And so we're going to need to think about like what happened there. So let's go actually look at what happened and see if we can understand better what's going on. So I'm going to copy this weird path, and I'm going to use push D to get there. Push D is like CD, but it creates a stack of directories, so I can pop D to come back to where I am easily instead of having to remember where I was and CD back to here. It's really useful. And so when I do push D, it shows me the current stack of directories. And my current directory is the temp directory, but below that on the stack is my current working directory for the log processing project. And so if I do pop D, I would come back to here, and I wouldn't have to remember how to CD to there. So now if I do an ls, I can see the files there. Now what's going to be there depends on the BATS test. It copies things to this location, and you have to look in the BATS test to see exactly what's going on there. In other parts of this project, often the relevant files are in a directory called data that's in here. Here, if we look at result.html, this shows that we have the header and we have the middle, but we don't seem to have the end. And that seems to be a problem because we're supposed to have in simple, there's supposed to be a, if we look at test output, oops, simple test output, it's supposed to have a first, a middle, and a footer. And ours is missing the footer. And that's the problem, is we don't seem to have the footer. And if we diff our result with simple wrap contents test output, I reversed the order. So this is saying how to get from ours to the test output, and we would get there by appending these lines. So that shows us what's missing in our instance. So that seems to be the problem, is that we somehow are missing the footer. So if I pop D here, I'm now back in my other directory. And if I Emacs bin wrap contents, I'm like, oh, I put the header in and I put the middle, but I forgot to put the footer in. So if I put the footer in, hopefully that will work. Bats, test, wrap, contents. Woohoo! And that succeeded. And I realized, actually looking at this, we get yelled at by shell script here because none of my variables are quoted. So if we check that just to confirm that I'm right, shell check bin wrap contents. Yeah, I get yelled at 4 times for not quoting my stuff. And this is really what that ought to look like. And I'm not going to mess with that right now because that's not the point of this exercise. So we've seen how to get the directory where BATS puts its stuff, and we've seen a little bit about how to read the diff output and how to actually look at some of the setup for BATS. So hopefully that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.